All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our community of practice all around alternatives to exclusionary discipline. I'm very excited to see so many familiar names on the screen. Again, I loaded this morning to our school psych faculty who participate in our bi-monthly school psych calls, but today, we're really going to dive into these alternatives to exclusionary discipline. Some of these decisions may not rest with you as assessment specialists. Some of these decisions may be building level administrators. Some of these may be your director of schools, right? But the purpose of this is to show you that there could be other ways, other mechanisms for you to address exclusionary discipline and other ideas that you could even propose to your district leadership. Again, you will be muted the whole time. If you do have questions, feel free to drop them into the chat box. Just a word of welcome. I am April Ebbinger. I'm the Director of Psychological and Behavioral Services for the Department of Ed. I am joined by Allison Collins, who is our Senior Manager of Complex Behavior, and Jamie Seek, who is our Speech, Language, and Related Services Coordinator Manager. We change our titles so many times that it's hard to keep track. So let's dive right in and let's look at our agenda for today. So we are going to start off with what is exclusionary discipline? How is it defined? We're going to look at our discipline data in reference to some of our national trends. We're going to talk a little bit through some areas of significant disproportionality around discipline. And then we're going to dive into some alternatives and share some examples of some districts who have really held tightly, adopted some alternatives, and have shown some really positive growth with their numbers, as well as increasing some outcomes for their students. And then we're going to talk about some general recommendations for moving forward, and then some questions and discussions. So for your purposes too, parts of this training were delivered at our regional special education summits. Unfortunately, Hurricane Helene impacted who and how many of those we could have. And then I also recently was able to share some of these slides with our at our school law conference, which was attended by our school board attorneys and some of our directors of school. I have to say, many of our directors of school were really excited and eager to hear around alternatives to exclusionary discipline. So I do think, especially if we do have leaders on the call, I think these conversations are worth having. And going back to your district leadership and really engaging in some root cause analysis around your own discipline data, but then also looking at what your code of conduct says currently, and are there some avenues and opportunities for you to afford and allow for some alternatives outside of just the traditional suspension expulsion. So let's jump right into it. So what is exclusionary discipline? This is pulled from the US DOE and their definition. It is a removal of a student with a disability from a class, school, or any other educational program or activity for violating those school-based rules or your codes of conduct. And this could be on a short term, so a short-term suspension, a long-term basis when we're looking at expulsions. And any of these examples could include the following: detentions, ISS, OSS, suspensions from riding the school bus, right? Any of those disciplinary transfers, those remandments to alternative schools, and even those referrals to law enforcement, including those referrals that result in a school-related arrest. So when we think about exclusionary discipline, it's anything that is removing them from their current placement. And what else can we consider and think through in terms of offering those students to keep them in that placement while remediating whatever the disciplinary infraction was that precipitated the need to consider if exclusionary discipline was appropriate. So let's look at some national data here. This is very much in line with where we are in Tennessee. Our preschool enrollment, we have about 23% of our students who are enrolled in preschool across the country are served under IDA, so 23%. But look at the number of expulsions in preschool related to students with disabilities versus students without disabilities. Almost 57% of our expulsions in preschool are made up of our students who are served under IDA. So we would typically like to see a little bit more alignment there, where about 23% of our expulsions, I would say in theory, in general, we would prefer there would be no expulsions at that preschool level, but certainly not almost 2 times the amount from the enrollment numbers. So again, our numbers don't quite match some of this. So we're going to look at Tennessee's data in just a moment, but just for your knowledge, nationally, this is where we see a lot of our expulsions. Our national data of school-age students, you'll see a breakdown here. School-age students with disabilities represent that 13.2% of total student enrollment. And then our school-age students with disabilities receive approximately 20.5% of in-school suspensions and 24.5% of our out-of-school suspensions. So certainly much higher than we would anticipate given the enrollment of the number of students with disabilities across the country. Let's look at one area that has gotten a lot of notice, not only by the feds, our Office of Civil Rights, but certainly has been the talk in media for a number of years. And this is the use of exclusionary discipline primarily with our African American Black students. If you'll notice within our national data, and these are 2019, 2020 data, a little bit of a lag, but again, these are national data. Black students make up approximately 17.2% of our students served under IDA. So even then, if we think about school-age students on that previous slide, where we were looking at around 13% of our students in total, there is a little bit of discrepancy, disproportionality there, even in identifying and over-identifying Black and African American students under IDA. But look at the numbers around suspension and expulsion for Black students who have disability. Almost 44% of our students, our Black students with disabilities, are suspended, expelled compared to other race ethnicities, which is a significant number. This is also very much true for Tennessee, for our districts that have been identified for significant disproportionality in the area of discipline. All of them are for Black African American students. So I think it's something for us to consider, and especially going back and really owning our own data and going and looking at our current suspension expulsion data and really digging into those trends and identifying opportunities for us to either offer alternatives to specific schools or figuring out various mechanisms to address any disproportionality that may be present within your schools through training and professional development. I think I could probably ask all of you on this call around long-term impacts of the use of suspension expulsion. Most of us on this call know that exclusionary discipline practices typically don't have the outcomes that are often intended. But suspensions count for over 3 million missed instructional days from school. So it's kind of the chicken or the egg for me, right? When we start to use these exclusionary discipline practices and we start to remove students with disabilities from their placements for longer and longer periods of time, it stands with reason that the students will essentially become farther and farther away from meeting their grade level expectations, from making the amount of reasonable progress on their IEP goals that we would anticipate. And so for a lot of us, we say, well, did the behavior cause the academic deficits, or did the academic deficits cause the behavioral incidents or behavior that is excluding them from school? And so we get stuck kind of in this hamster wheel of trying to remediate, but really we need to go to the root of the problem. And if it is a behavioral concern, how are we going to build those skill deficits, those competencies that need to be evident? Or are we still going to just continue to rely on excluding them from their placements, excluding them from access to their grade level peers, and expecting them to be able to return and then be on the same track as any other student who has been attending full time? Out of school suspensions do not serve, as all of us know, as a deterrent for future problematic behavior, and also typically increase the likelihood of school dropout. Our Tennessee data supports that. So Tennessee districts, as we were working with our districts who were found to be significantly disproportionate in the area of discipline this past year, 100% of them did not meet graduation targets and did not meet their dropout rate targets, meaning that they had high numbers of dropouts and their graduation rate was lower than we would have where our targets were set, where they needed to be. And the correlation here is certainly something to consider. If we are relying on a lot of exclusionary discipline practices, are we then kind of, essentially setting our school districts up for failure by then impacting negatively our graduation rates? And certainly nobody across the state wants to impact our students' likelihood of being able to walk across that stage and earn a regular ed diploma. But by the nature of relying solely on some of these exclusionary discipline practices, we could be, again, really impacting students long term by the use of these. So something to consider, and data that we would really encourage you to look at within your own districts. All of this is public facing data. Go back and look at your graduation rates, your dropout rate targets. Look at where you're meeting, where you're hitting those or not hitting those in relation to your suspension and expulsion rates across the state. This again has been something that has been really targeted from a federal level for a long time. And so this prompted this Dear Colleague letter in 2022, essentially citing that there is an urgent need for state education agencies and local education agencies to improve the implementation of IDEA so that all eligible children with disabilities are served appropriately and equitably. For years, we have seen this data demonstrated clear disparities in the use of discipline for students and children with disabilities. And we need to ensure that we are doing our due diligence on the front end. And I know sometimes that may look very simply as creating some type of behavioral plan, an FBA, BIP. It could be looking at that child's placement and their current services and supports. But again, when we start to think about expanding our scope of offering alternatives to exclusionary discipline, the goal should be about remediating whatever was causing that behavioral infraction to occur in the first place. If any of you are fans of Ross Greene, the explosive child, the disruptive child, you know that he really posits that disciplinary issues are all founded in skill deficits. So do our students have the appropriate skills that they need to meet our expectations across settings? And if they don't, that's not a student issue. That's an adult issue that we need to improve our processes and procedures around ensuring that everybody understands expectations across grade levels. We are modeling those expectations. We are providing feedback for their ability to perform those expectations, and we are providing that on a continuum of feedback, right? And so again, we need to take a really hard stance on our disciplinary use across our state, but also nationally. So what does our data say? So this is from 22-23 school year. Please note on the next few slides, there's going to be a lot of bars, so I'm going to try to walk you through them. I was trying to show the data in multiple ways, and this certainly making graphs is maybe not my gift, but I wanted to show you in relation to percentages versus just overall prevalence rates. So this one is for in-school suspensions for the 22-23 school year. These are students who are receiving these suspensions based on primary disability only. We're not looking at those students under secondary, tertiary. These are primary disabilities only. So if you look at the prevalence rates of those disabilities, so the blue line are the total number of students with disabilities in that category. Versus the red box, which is the students receiving ISS. And then the orange line is the percentage of those students receiving ISS. You'll notice here, as many of us can visually see, that our students with emotional disturbance are receiving the majority of our ISS in-school suspensions across the state, even though they make up a smaller number of our eligibility categories, okay? So something to consider when you're thinking about how you serve your students with emotional disturbance. I will say, by and large, when we look at disproportionate representation for emotional disturbance, and we are going out and looking at your evaluations and looking at the plan, the IEP, what services and supports you're providing, very few of our students with emotional disturbance are receiving any type of counseling, psychological support, social skills support. Very few. The majority of our students with emotional disturbance, their services are academic in nature. Not that that's wrong, But when we think through knowing that the majority of our students across the state are receiving ISS, are categorized under emotional disturbance, then we need to kind of work backwards and look at, are we providing the right supports and services on the front end to prevent them from getting to a place where they are needing an in-school suspension. Let's look at based on primary disability for our out-of-school suspensions. Again, you'll notice here that emotional disturbance, students with that primary eligibility are receiving the majority of our out-of-school suspensions. And even so far, and I think you noticed on the previous slide too, our students with traumatic brain injury are also receiving pretty significant amounts of in-school suspension and out-of-school suspension, which also startled me a little bit as I was digging into and disaggregating this data. Something to consider, are the IEPs appropriately matched to those students' needs? Have we identified them in all areas of suspected disability? And then what preventative measures can we put into place either at a tier 1 level or through that IEP process to help mitigate some of the likelihood of these behaviors from occurring or reoccurring? Let's dig into by race ethnicity. So you'll notice here, based on the breakdown, again, the blue bars are those students who were found at our December 1, 2022 count to be receiving special education services. We have just under 1 million students who are receiving special education services. The majority of our students across the state are white students who are receiving IDEA-related services. And then you'll notice, based on percentages across all of our race ethnicities here. The orange bar, again, is the percentage. So some of the ones that you may be concerned about, I would share those concerns based on the prevalence rates, would be our African American Black students, our multiracial students, and even our Native American students that are receiving pretty significant high numbers of ISS. Is that based because on some implicit biases across the state? Maybe, but it also could be that we need to, again, ramp up and create really robust structures across settings. This is not just a special education issue. This is, how are we working with all of our students within our school buildings to understand and build out what the expectations are behaviorally and academically, and then ensuring that students have the tools and the resources to meet our expectations and holding students accountable appropriately. OSS suspensions by race ethnicity, again, you'll notice similar trends here. But our Black African American students are receiving the majority of our out-of-school suspensions, even though they make up almost a third of the number of students with disabilities compared to white students. So something to consider and look at, knowing that data has strongly showed that out-of-school suspensions, exclusionary discipline practices do not decrease the likelihood of the behaviors from reoccurring. In fact, they actually promote the behaviors from occurring again. So using these techniques across our school districts may have those negative impacts to our other outcomes that we would not foresee across graduation rate, dropout rate, achievement rate, right? We need to be cautious of overutilizing something that traditionally has not been shown to be successful. Now let's look at in-school suspensions by grade. Okay. So for me, as I look at this, in-school suspensions, and this was again for the 22-23 school year, we noticed that there were no in-school suspensions for preschool. I would have to say pew, right? I hope that that is not a practice that's being utilized. But even the amount of numbers that are relevant here for kindergarten, first grade are a little startling. But what do you really notice? What grade bands are really being impacted by these in-school suspensions? Well, it seems to kick off and have a marked increase from the transition from elementary school to middle school. That's really important for our schools to identify and know. So as you're thinking through these data, if you pull these data in your district, maybe we need to talk about, do we have strong transition programs from elementary to middle to high? Is there a transition program? Are there strong orientation practices in place to ensure that all the students who are entering and coming and transitioning from elementary to middle understand the expectations, know what and how the settings are different and how they compare from elementary to middle? Do you have strong mentorship opportunities to ensure that you have students who are coming in and they have strong mentorship, maybe not just by faculty, but also maybe by older peers in their buildings? What do those programs look for, like for you in your district? Do you have strong RTIB processes, that response to intervention behavioral processes set up, where again, everybody's speaking that common language, that we are teaching expectations across settings in order, again, to mitigate some of these concerns? We also know that students are really engaging in maybe some maladaptive behaviors. They're going through a lot of changes and puberty changes around this age and grade. And do we have structures and supports into place where we can help students get through that period, especially with when we think about their exposure to social media and other influences that are somewhat out of our control, but we need to think of interventions or supports or resources that can be put into place to support the students during this time, as well as potentially their families. Let's look at that out-of-school suspension by grade. Very similar in data. You'll notice that we do have a few preschoolers who had out-of-school suspensions by grade. I will say that as we look at this data, we also have seen a lot of folks reaching out to the department around informal removals. And we always want to be really cautious around the use of informal removals. Students with disabilities are entitled to procedural protections under IDEA. And if we are sending students home and calling parents to have them pick up, we need to be coding that in the system as a suspension. We need to ensure that we're coding that appropriately, so then we know when procedurally we need to implement potentially that manifestation determination review. But the numbers here are very similar to the in-school suspensions. Again, as we know with these out-of-school suspensions, they're not necessarily serving the purpose by which we think they are, and the outcomes are probably not there. I know often in the school districts I've been in and worked in previously, the in-school suspensions were really just kind of this holding tank where students would come in and they would sit. And often it was a very reinforcing environment because they may not have had work sent down by their teachers, so they get to sit, play on their phones, stare at the wall and do nothing. They get to talk to peers potentially. We need to be really cautious about the use of some of these suspension tactics in order to decrease these behaviors, and think kind of globally and universally across our settings to understand how we can best approach working with some of our students. Let's look at this average length of removal. So for ISS and OSS, for out-of-school suspension, the average length of removal was 2.8 days. And this is per incident, folks. This is per incident. ISS was 1.9 days. So almost up to 2 days there. And then OSS almost up to 3 days. We know based on our data analysis that the majority of students that are being given ISS or OSS are repeat offenders, that you'll see in just a moment. And think of how these days start to stack up. If we have several, let's say the student has had 3 or 4 incidents per semester, we're looking at multiple weeks of missing instruction. Again, when we think back to those 3 million missed instructional days, and that's national data, how are we really mitigating that? Do we have a plan for when the student returns to be able to catch up? And we're talking about our students with disabilities who already are sometimes at a disadvantage for staying on track academically. We need to have plans to be able to transition them back if they are in these exclusionary discipline settings, to ensure that they are able to obtain whatever missed instruction or services are necessary. So let's look at the common offenses. So ISS and OSS look very similar here. So for ISS, I really wanted to dig into why were these students being put into these in-school suspension settings. And unfortunately, how we aggregate this data at a state level is we pull it from your students' information system, your SIS, and it comes into our EIS system, and this is how we work with it. And so we ask certain SIS systems to essentially have these kind of broad headings or titles, and violation of school rules is obviously the biggest offense here. But when we started to dig into what the violation of school rules was, the number one offense that landed a student with a disability in ISS was for non-compliance disrespect. Again, not saying that we need to accept that students are going to be non-compliant or disrespectful, but do they have the tools and the skills in order to be compliant? Do they have the skills and the tools to be respectful? Have we set the setting, right, and the environment in such a manner to ensure that they understand those expectations? And often when we consult with districts, especially when there is an instance where maybe a parent has filed an administrative complaint around the use of discipline, um, we always need to be asking questions on the front end as to what we can do to prevent these issues from happening again. And there have been many times where even when we look at maybe even isolation or restraint reports, when we look at the antecedent of what happened right before they had to use, the restraint or isolation, there were so many different methods potentially that could have prevented the teen from getting there. But sometimes we get into this battle between the student and the teacher, and there's a little bit of ego there sometimes where, the teacher thinks, I'm going to win, I'm going to win. And when we think through of de-escalating and trying to use the very much empirical strategies around de-escalation, in my opinion, non-compliance and disrespect, we need to have some other solutions and other strategies outside of landing them in an in-school suspension arena. OSS again looks very similar. We do see a little bit more for fighting compared to the in-school suspension. But again, when we look at this violation of school rules, the OSS looked very similar. It was for non-compliance, but the majority of the ones for OSS here were for repeat offenders, the students who had several infractions over and over and over again. And as opposed to thinking through what other preventative supports they could put into place, we were just continuing to suspend them. I don't know if anybody on this call looks at the climate survey. It comes out annually. So the climate survey is given to essentially a variety of stakeholders across the state, students being one of them. One of the first questions I typically go and look at in that climate survey, it asks something to the effect of, do you, as a student, have at least one adult in your building that you feel comfortable and safe to talk to? And I love that question because I think every student in the state of Tennessee should have at least one trusting adult that they can go to. And this past year's data, it was almost 20% of the respondents said no to that question. And are these the same students who are continually in this hamster wheel of suspension, whether in school or out of school, right? Are they the same ones who don't have a trusted adult? Maybe they do have some really marked skill deficits and school is hard. And instead of having to come and persevere through those hard times of school because they don't have a trusted adult to talk to in that building, they are engaging in these maladaptive behaviors in order to be sent to a place that's not requiring them to have that same level of rigor and persistence through a hard task, or they can go home. And all of us can agree that home is a much better place to be than school. I think all of us love going home on a weeknight or on Friday afternoon and having no requirements of it, no expectations of us. And I certainly hope, and I would think that you guys feel the same, that when students are in out of school suspensions, I don't think that they're out there, reading Shakespeare and volunteering in their communities. They're probably playing video games on an iPad. And we need to, again, as we start to think through these alternatives to exclusionary discipline, it is again about remediating the skill deficit that got them into that behavioral infraction in the first place, giving them the skills and the tools that they need to navigate their environments appropriately, communicate appropriately with either peers and or teachers and staff, and then reinforcing that through modeling and that process that we would really dig into at tier one around that positive behavioral interventions and supports across our school buildings. One of the things, the few presentations we were able to do with our SPED directors at our special education summit a few months ago now. I think it was back in September and October, when I asked the question in the groups of how many of you have school-wide, PBIS or RTIB that you're implementing. it was less than five were raising their hands in every single session, which is quite startling to me, because we don't approach behavior in the same way we approach it for skill deficits in academics, do we? And I know that we have a lot on our plates, and we're tasking you with more and more each and every year. But we really can't expect students to understand how to behave unless we teach them how to do that. I know going back to when I was still teaching, the majority of our fights were for simple miscommunications, bumping each other in the hallway, and they didn't have the language or the tools to be able to not fight. I think, again, we have to be able to teach and equip our students to handle those types of interactions across settings. And if we're not doing that proactively, then who is at fault, right? We can't expect something that we haven't taught. In the same manner, we can't expect students to be, proficient at calculus unless we teach them what a derivative is. So again, really having these conversations with your school leaders, with your faculty, as you start to look at your own data and make some decisions how to best move forward. So let's get into these alternatives to exclusionary discipline. These are very much well-founded in research. The majority of these were taken from the OSEP letters that have been pushed out, or other states that have really implemented some innovative ways and tactics to decrease the reliance on exclusionary discipline. So I kind of alluded to this before, but what about appropriate in-school suspension? So could in-school suspension be a place where they are receiving the necessary remediation that's missing, whether that's through academic tutoring or instruction, building their competency in some areas that are shown to be a deficit, maybe some social skills, skill building in anger management. What does an appropriate in-school suspension setting look like? And it's not just sitting staring at a cinder block wall. We need to ensure that students are being given the tools so when they do re-enter and transition back into their general education placement, they have what they need to be successful. Schools need to have really clearly defined procedures for exiting and returning to the classroom. I think often we assume that they come back from ISS or OSS and something, miraculous or, supernatural has happened to them, that they just know what to do. I think that's really kind of foolish on our parts, is that unless we have really done some good debriefing with the student, really train them up and giving them the skills that they need to be able to transition back, we're just setting them up for failure. Okay. And again, we really need to guard against using ISS as a mechanism to allow students to avoid attending classes. I was consulting with somebody this week, and essentially this child is very bright, and she knows that if she screams loud enough, they will call her mom and the mom will come pick her up. I mean, these students have learned the workaround, and certainly we need to intervene and teach appropriate replacement behaviors. But by sending a lot of our students home or sending them out of the classroom where expectations probably are a lot lowered than where they are in the general education classroom, we're not going to, again, derive the outcomes we anticipate. So what about instead of ISS or instead of OSS, or maybe in conjunction with those two things? Maybe this is what happens in OSS or ISS. What about embedding short courses or self-study modules that students can complete? They could be really on a variety of topics, but it could be around building their self-awareness, their skills, their knowledge in social skills, communication skills, conflict resolution, drug and alcohol abuse, anger management. There's a lot of curriculum out there that is relevant or kind of captures any of those areas. Could we require students to complete some of that before, either before they get to a place where they do have a serious code of conduct violation, or could we embed that as an alternative to use of exclusionary discipline, where they complete certain modules or courses in order to build their competency and then be able to stay in the general education classroom or either re-enter into the general education classroom? Community of service, we have a number of school districts across the state that are utilizing community service in lieu of ISS and OSS. And a lot have found some pretty some pretty good results from it. And so typically these are programs that permit students, and this would have to be in consultation, obviously, with the parent, that would allow them to perform a certain number of hours in a supervised setting, whether that's at school or in the community, outside of school hours. So they're not missing instruction that is so necessary, but now we're going to ensure that that punitive consequence, they are paying us back for whatever that was. So in some school districts, they're having the students work in either the school that they're in, or they're having them go to, an appropriate other level of school. So some of the high schoolers may go to the middle schoolers may go to the elementary. Some of our school districts are utilizing community organizations, nursing homes, daycares, other facilities to complete community service hours. Some of the startling outcomes that I have really appreciated listening to the feedback, even anecdotally, from some of the school districts that are engaging in this, is that students start to become more career aware by being able to go out in this community service capacity, and they learn about not only themselves but about job opportunities that are out there, which is really incredible kind of periphery benefit of utilizing community service as an alternative to exclusionary discipline. But certainly something that I think your districts could consider um, if you would like to kind of move the marker on the use of suspension expulsion. Required counseling, we know that with our new law around consent, in many cases, students who would be eligible to go through any type of required counseling, whether through your school counselor, your school psychologist, your school social worker, parent consent would likely be required. But could we engage students in some type of individual or group-based counseling in the school or during the school day, or however you wanted to structure it, that would be about improving their ability to work through conflicts with anger management, building their social skills. What does that look like for those individual students? I don't think every student requires that level of intensive counseling and support, but for some of our students, they would. And in kind of a secondary benefit for this, would some of those students who identified on that climate and culture survey that they didn't have a trusted adult in the building, could they be building that relationship with the person who's maybe working with them in this counseling setting? But again, I think counseling affords a lot of our students a safe space to learn skills while also practicing skills, and then be able to generalize those out to their general education settings. And counseling can be very effective when done appropriately for a number of our students. When we start to think about how we can decrease the use of ISS, OSS, this may be certainly a viable option. Restitution, I think many of us on this call have heard of restitution. So essentially allowing the students to help restore or improve the school environment by addressing the problems caused by the student's misconduct. So this may involve cleaning up something that maybe the student destroyed, or even taking a step further by making that classroom area something better, by cleaning that space, something to that effect, picking up trash, washing tables. A lot of this can be built into your current code of conduct that they have to, be required to, if it is like property, environmental kind of destruction, that they will have to put it back into the same manner that they did, or the same space that they did when they entered. But this is something that certainly can be embedded within your processes, and a lot of these can happen concurrently. You may be wanting to do some social skills with the student while they're also being required some level of restitution. These don't have to happen in isolation. You can build some of these together as opportunities for your students to, again, build competency and then also have that level of restitution. Restitution doesn't just have to happen in their environment either. Restitution can also happen between people, whether that's peers or adults. And so when we start to think through how you would get to that layer of restitution. You probably want to involve your obviously your building level administrators to make sure that they're on board. You probably want to involve the parents in this, but you certainly want to ensure that there's a lot of stakeholders that understand what the expectations are and how you get to a level of restitution, because you may need either like you as the school psychologist to help support, if, especially if it is a peer-to-peer or a peer-to-adult that needs to get to a level of restitution. You may need to help mediate some of that or bring in somebody that is trained in that aspect. But certainly, this is a viable option for our students. Conflict resolution. I'm going to spend a little chunk of time on this because I am a very big believer that we have to train our students, and not only our students, but our faculty around conflict resolution. I think many of us assume that even as adults, we have the skills to appropriately and professionally resolve conflicts. And many of us on this call have been very well trained in conflict resolution. And some of you guys go through your annual, restraint, isolation, crisis training that focuses a lot on de-escalation. Um, but one of the biggest areas that we see, and if we go back to the data, we see some clear evidence that our adults in our school buildings are not proficient in de-escalation. And I would encourage all of our school districts to consider how they can embed de-escalation into every annual professional development, every faculty meeting. For me, de-escalation is like a muscle, similar to us riding a bike, right? In exercising. It needs to be something that we practice continually in order to, one, maintain our proficiency, but to improve our proficiency. I don't know if any of you guys had seen it was in Middle Tennessee, Nashville area, where a person was on one of the Nashville bridges and Bono was walking by, and Bono successfully intervened and was able to get the person off of the bridge prior to them attempting suicide. It was a big story in the Nashville area. And when I was presenting this in our specific regions, I always push to our attendees. If you were walking across that bridge, because also, I don't know if anybody saw the video, there were a number of people that saw this person on the other side of the railing and just kept walking. And that's very much a natural human bodily reaction to moments of crisis and escalation. We essentially go into that fight, flight, or freeze, and now fawn, right? And some engage and some don't. But in school settings, especially as faculty and staff of schools, our reaction hopefully is to engage, but engage appropriately. So if you at this moment were walking across that bridge and saw somebody on the other side of that railing, would you know what to say? Or would you want to phone a friend and say, hey, I don't know what to do here? If you at all have any hesitancy about engaging, I would really encourage you to, again, practice and build that muscle memory around de-escalation. I always joke too, you know, if you're proficient at de-escalation, if you can think back to the last time you got into an argument with your child, or your significant other. And many of us on this call know that there's so many variables involved with our ability to be good conflict resolution participants, right? So many variables. For me is if I'm hungry, I'm going to be a little bit more argumentative than if I'm not. And so I do think, though, that not only our students need to have these skills, but our faculty and staff need to have these skills. And we need to practice it in the same manner that we would be practicing a new strategy to teach in the classroom. We need to be practicing this in the same manner of a new, reading technique. All of this needs to be practiced by our staff, because I do think if we have more competency in our staff members around appropriate de-escalation, we're going to see our numbers of ISS and OSS fall quite naturally. But do we also embed this for our students? Do you have periods of your day, maybe it's an advisory or if it's morning meeting, where you're building the student's ability to empathize, take responsibility, be able to reflect on making a mistake? Goodness, all of us on this call have made mistakes in our lives, and we need to be able to identify those mistakes and acknowledge we made a mistake, and then find opportunities to make restitution for that mistake and do better in the future. That's the human journey. And our students need to be given time and space to learn how to do that and to have a space to essentially make mistakes safely and then be guided back from that process. So again, when we start to see conflict resolution, de-escalation, I love that, and this was from 2021, but students with the highest levels of exposure to restorative practices, okay, highest levels of exposure, and we're going to use conflict resolution and restorative practices here synonymously, experience black-white discipline disparities that were 5 times smaller than those experienced by students with the lowest levels of exposure to restorative practices. So the data is very clear that in order to reduce some of this disparity between discipline, exclusionary discipline between race ethnicities, is we need to be increasing the awareness of conflict resolution across not only our students, but also our faculty and staff. I remember recently, I mean, not recently, it was probably a couple years ago now, we were doing some required training around restraint isolation and the use of de-escalation in a Tennessee school district. So we went through all of the, legal and procedural requirements around restraint and isolation. But then the second part of the day, we were really digging into de-escalation. And I loved because the SROs were in the room with us and we were doing some role playing. And it made a lot of us uncomfortable. A lot of them were uncomfortable because they had never been asked to really do this in front of their peers. And it really showed me how often we need to be doing those types of activities, how often we need to be practicing de-escalation, because what was so markedly clear to me is even our SROs struggled a little bit with how you engage and de-escalate in those situations. So it's not just you guys as assessment specialists, it's not just our special ed teachers. We need to engage with our general education teachers. We need to pull in our staff, our paraprofessionals. We need to pull in all that ancillary staff and SROs even to ensure that they have that minimum competency around de-escalation and conflict resolution. Another area that we see a lot of success in a few of our districts that are engaging in this is through the use of substance use and abuse interventions. So many of our students, instead of ISS, OSS, depending on first offense, second offense, third offense, and such, a lot of them on first offense for substance use or having substances in schools are being required to go to these substance use abuse classes. A lot of our districts have partnered with their local community sheriff's offices. A lot of our SROs have information and access to the curriculum around substance use interventions. And so far, I'm really excited. We have a couple of districts right now that are really pushing these really hard because of the increase in the use of vapes and having other illicit substances on campuses. They are really trying to push this pretty hard in the district. This also, again, would require parents to provide some level of consent, but there is a lot of good data that supports that students who do participate in a district provided drug and alcohol education class, of those 78% of students and 70% of parents reported the students' substance use had decreased since beginning the groups. So I think it's worth acknowledging and noting that there are some, again, either preventative interventions that we can do, or if there is a first offense, second offense, depending on what you decide as with your district leadership around your code of conduct, what you can do to engage with students instead of the ISS OSS to help prevent the behavior from reoccurring in the future. I know that when Allison Collins and I were meeting with several of our districts who had disproportionate representation for discipline, vaping came up a lot. And I want to ensure that you guys also recognize some other mechanisms that you can use as preventative measures. There were several school districts that noted that they did a lot of posting around their school as being a drug-free zone. They did posting on their kiosks outside their door, reminding students not to bring those types of things into the school building, and which helped them decrease the finding of those overall. And again, really working with your community members as necessary to equip students to understand the seriousness of bringing those types of substances into school, one, but then two, what that means for them long term when they're engaging in the use of those substances. So what are some other prerequisite expectations that we would want to see when we're thinking through these alternatives? You've heard me allude to this a lot this afternoon, but does your district have a systematic method for identifying students who display behavioral or mental health concerns? The majority of our districts that have strong RTIB processes in place are not found to be significantly disproportionate in the area of discipline, which I think is a really interesting correlation. Okay. So we want to ensure, again, that we have systematic methods for identifying those students with mental health behavioral concerns in the same manner that you would do if they had a deficit in math or writing or reading. How do you identify those students? And then what preventative supports can you provide? Again, this is all about early intervention and what that looks like and how we can really walk alongside what you're already doing for academics and build in some opportunities to identify students who may be having some behavioral concerns and investing in them in the same manner that we do for students who are having academic concerns. I would posit, and I hope many of you would agree, that if we're not intervening early with those students who have behavioral issues, we're going to see those continue to the extent that we're going to see academic problems, or we're going to get to a place of almost no return. And so it is in your best interest to identify early, to intervene, monitor those interventions, and provide the supports that are necessary, whether it's a general education student or a student with a disability. So this is a sample risk analysis that a team in a Tennessee district uses to identify those students who would be considered low risk, at risk, or high risk for needing behavioral intervention. And these are the metrics that they use. I will say that student risk screening scale would require parental consent to administer, but they do obtain parental consent to do so. And then again, this is how they determine those students who are at risk. The students who are always asking to go to the nurse's office or going to the school counselor's office, who are coming in late every morning or leaving early, or who have a large number of office discipline referrals. This may be right in line with what you see as your risk analysis, but you can bring in the methodology that makes sense to you. Maybe it isn't. Tardies are not a concern for you in your school building, but maybe it is unexcused absences. So thinking through what this looks like for you in your school district, but embedding this very similarly as we do within our academic kind of data team meetings for identifying students that may need additional behavioral or mental health support. So what are some other prerequisites that we need to consider? Again, creating that strong sense of community and climate through the use of school-wide positive behavioral supports. We really encourage you that if you don't know how to get started on that, we have a free contract with the Tennessee Support Center, TSC, that will come into your district, and help you conduct a root cause needs-based assessment to identify how you can either improve your existing structures or create them from scratch. That's why we pay them a lot of money to come out and ensure that every school district has access to a positive behavioral support system, or RTIB system, in our state. Again, it benefits not only the students, but it benefits your staff as well. We know that discipline and problematic behavior is a huge concern, and we absolutely acknowledge that. But typically, our first question to you is, do you have a tier one based approach to behavior and mental health in your district? And if the answer is no, that's always going to be our first recommendation for teams. I would continue to ensure that you're building strong adult-student relationships across your district. This could be through a variety of mechanisms where maybe you are implementing some type of mentorship program. Students who are flagging at risk on your risk analysis for behavior mental health, maybe they're assigned an adult in the building, whatever that looks like. And it doesn't have to necessarily be so formal, but continuing to foster those adult-student relationships will always be critical. Now, I don't want to be too kind of cliched about this, because will every student, if they don't have or if they do have a strong adult-student relationship, will that prevent them from engaging in maladaptive, problematic behavior? No. But a lot of this is just these preventative approaches to decrease the likelihood that these events will occur. Increasing parental and community engagement is always really powerful. We know that when parents are engaged in the educations of their children, that academic achievement increases, attendance increases, behaviors decrease. So again, we have another contract with the ARC of Tennessee that really will come out, assist you with whatever initiative you have around parental engagement. Maybe you would like to start a parent advisory board. The ARC of Tennessee will help you do that. Maybe you would like to hold a parent family night. The ARC of Tennessee will help you do that. All of this, again, is free of charge. How can we continually engage parents in our community in order to come in and ensure that our school is not just a building in a community, but it is of the community? And you guys have those partnerships and collaborations, again, I think is always going to work in your best interest, especially if you do want to implement some type of community service program within your community. This would be a vital inclusion. And then again, incorporating that conflict resolution, peer mediation, and de-escalation into classroom learning. We didn't spend a whole lot of time on peer mediation, but if you are interested in that, it's certainly something to look into. But peer mediation is where, again, peers tend to, it's kind of in line with a group contingency. Peers are very much more willing to listen to their peers often, but take feedback from their peers often. And so peer mediation can be a very useful tool in helping not only build competency, but implement any type of consequence for students, especially if they're coming from peers, and allowing peers to help mediate the problems that are occurring. But again, we would always recommend incorporating and embedding the conflict resolution, de-escalation into not only your classroom learning, but also into your learning for your faculty and staff. Just some final recommendations. What does your discipline data say? I hope everyone on this call, if you're only assigned to one school building, I would hope, if I asked you, I would guess that you may not have access to all of your discipline data, but you certainly could probably find somebody who did. Are your leadership teams at each individual school reviewing your discipline data either quarterly, monthly, at every data team meeting? Are you identifying those repeat offenders who you can implement some type of intervention with? What are the offenses? In one school, we were talking to the school district leaders for disproportionate representation, and they said, April, we already know that every single incident that we're probably talking about is at one school. Okay, as we talk through that. So what does that mean? Well, as we were looking at the data, every single out-of-school suspension was really targeted back to one offense. And I was like, okay, I'm on, kind of leaning in to listen. And it was around tardies. Almost every single student that had been given an in-school or out-of-school suspension, it was based on the number of tardies to get to and from class. Well, what can we do as a school or as a school district to increase the chances and likelihood of getting them to class on time, decreasing the time that they're roaming around the hallways? What can we do preventatively to do that? And so even just aligning and making contact and connections with other districts to say what works there, what have you done to decrease this, and and ensuring that this doesn't just have to be this way. A lot of times we think behavior is absolutely inevitable. And I have to tell you, folks, I believe that almost all maladaptive behavior or code of conduct violations are most often preventable if we have that right structure in place to identify early, provide the support and resources the students need and the faculty need in order to decrease that. And then again, I know this is kind of at a high level, but how can our IDA partnership grants support you in decreasing the use of suspension? So I know that I've talked a lot about this to our school psychologists, but every year, typically in the spring, our office opens up IDA partnership grants. So school districts can apply for one or both, but actually there's two grants that you could apply for. One's a preschool grant, so for pre-K, and the other one is a K-12 grant. And it really is essentially a grant for up to $100,000 for the K-12. I think it's $85,000 for the preschool grant. These are available annually in order to help support your initiatives to improve your data for students with disabilities. We have some schools, and by the way, Dr. Jennifer Jordan typically allocates about $8 million for these grants. We've never used all those funds. That's why we have our digital assessment library that we're able to fund, but we want to. And the initiatives have varied. Some of them are looking at how to build out more inclusive classrooms. Some are looking at how to build out really strong mental health classrooms, like a behavioral classroom that's focused solely on improving the skills competency in that behavioral classroom. Some are looking at curriculum for behavior or data collection tools for behavior to continue to ensure that we're decreasing their reliance on suspension and expulsion. Really, the sky's the limit as long as, and then even in some cases, some of this is building out and bringing on additional support faculty. Maybe it's a BCBA that needs to be involved in these conversations. Maybe it's just a school social worker that needs to be involved in these conversations. And if you don't have access to those, these funds could be a mechanism for you to bring another supports person on board. So please consider. I know that all of these applications go through your special education director, but even just flagging for them and reminding them that they're coming due in the spring and that, hey, you may have an idea that you want to float by them to see if it's something that they would be on board with. So especially around the use of behavior and the use of suspension expulsion, how can we use these funds to keep kids in school, give them access to their general education peers and curriculum, and improve the outcomes? It would be really incredible to see some of the initiatives that you guys think up to help support students with disabilities. Again, this may be at a higher level than some of you guys are authorized to do, but you may need to consider some policy changes. There have been some school districts that have banned the use of suspensions for classroom defiance, which obviously led to a significant decrease in the number of students suspended. What else can we do if classroom defiance is the number one precipitating behavior for the use of ISS or OSS? What else can we do? All of us on this call as adults know that daily, probably, we all say no, right? We all say no. A lot of us may not always say no appropriately, or we may not know how to say no appropriately, but we need to teach students how to appropriately say no in certain circumstances within reason, and then giving students choice and voice across their educational settings, but also, again, equipping teachers to understand how to interact with students who are in that moment of saying no, and working with our teachers to give them that common language as well for how they can appropriately work with those students. I know in a lot of school settings, many of you will say, April, they just need to do what I say when I say it. And as much as I appreciate that sentiment, that's just not always the world that we live in. And even I have an opportunity when somebody tells me to do something at work to voice my opinion. And I do that professionally. And there comes to be a point where is there space for our students to be able to voice their opinion? And then at the end of the day, can we still work to that sense and transition them to a place where they will accept no. But that is a process. And if you've ever had to teach a student how to accept no, it is a process. It's not something that we just say, I told you so, do what I say, and they're going to follow. We really need to work with our students and work with our faculty to teach that common language and teach appropriate ways to say no. Some districts are reconsidering local board policies around vaping. Again, just having these conversations with your local board attorney, your director of schools, and looking at where the changing landscape of our educational systems need to go. Not saying that this automatically needs to happen, but I think these are conversations that are worth having. Again, just proactive supports yield the greatest impact. Those interventions that target school climate and teacher-student interactions definitely have the potential to reduce these discipline disparities. Research has largely supported that. There's been several documents pushed out by OSEP that support the use of these school climate initiatives or positive behavioral supports in schools. And then if you need additional support, especially if there is one student that you are struggling with in terms of meeting behavioral expectations and you're at a loss. You've already looped in your BCBA. You do have strong tier 1 processes in place, but you are just not able to work with those students. We have supports through our technical assistance network, 10TAN, that are ready and willing to support you. We have contracts across domains. We have a preschool contract, the parent engagement contract. We have the TSC contract I noted earlier. We have a contract with Triad Autism. We have a contract with Triad Complex Behavior. We have assistive technology. If students are engaging in maladaptive behaviors because they don't have a reliable mode of communication. And I know I'm leaving out one. We have a secondary transition contract. We have so many free supports for you. So please use that QR code, reach out and request support as you need it. And then certainly our contract through Triad, the complex behavior contract, if there are those students who are engaging in really serious behaviors and you need support, reach out. They have monthly consultation for FBA BIPs. So let's say you've implemented your BIP and it's just not working to the extent that you hoped it would be. They have monthly consultation where you can come on and you can talk about your FBA BIP with a team of Triad BCBAs and look at your data and say, what am I missing here? Utilize these free supports. Really, we need to be exhausting every internal and external resource that we can to ensure that our students are receiving FAPE, that free and appropriate public education, in their least restrictive environment to that maximum extent appropriate. And that means we need to exhaust all of these resources before we're looking at any type of change of placement for these students. Here are some, and when we send out your certificates for this, we'll email out this presentation to you, but here are some really great behavioral guidance that has been pushed out by the feds that I hope that you'll review and look at, and then share with your stakeholders as you need to make sure that they understand what their requirements are for especially working with our students with disabilities. I think often I even battled this when I was teaching now almost 20 years ago, but they're not your students or their students, they're our students. And all of our students with disabilities do belong to a general education teacher or teacher somewhere in your building, and they are just as responsible for them as a special education teacher or that case manager. And I think once we really kind of shift that mindset and that philosophy in our school buildings, that all of our students are all of our students. And I think that really helps kind of move the marker on how we disproportionately use the provision of discipline with some of our students with disabilities. But in closing, I hope that this has kind of spurred you to have some good conversations with your schools, go back and look at your data, start talking about implementing some tier 1 supports across your school, your individual school, or even your school district. Whatever our team can do or any of our teams through our technical assistance network can do to support you as you embark on this, please let us know. Again, as those IDA partnership grants are released in the spring, your special education directors will be notified obviously first, but we are always willing to help you write and draft your grant proposal. If you've never written a grant, this would be a good opportunity to kind of get your feet wet in that world. But again, all of us on this call, Allison, Jamie, and I are always standing ready and willing to support you as you're working with your students across the state. I will stop there and give you just our contact information. And then I'm going to stop sharing our screen, but we really appreciate you today. And any questions you have, you guys can throw them into the chat.
April, I think there have been a couple of questions already in the chat. Is it okay if I go ahead and review those?
Absolutely. I think I stopped the
Wonderful.
recording. I hope I did. I hope I started the recording. Let's say that. So that's perfect. Go ahead, Jamie,
It
whenever you're
looks like
ready.